Hello and welcome to the debut episode of a brief history of Commodore 64 typing games. Subscribers to my channel will know all about my History of BBC Micro typing games series, where I look at games listings for the Beeb that feature in the many computing magazines of the 8-bit era, and play those games of course. This video is a spin-off from that series, which came about because several people asked in the comments on my BBC videos if I'd ever covered the C64. Well, now you know the answer. It is, however, a lot more difficult to source typing games for the Commodore machine, so as the title of the video suggests, this will just be a brief look at some of them. Just as I do in the BBC series, I'll take a look at the magazines that featured C64 typing listings, and I've chosen to look at 5 games that range from the early days of the machine in 1983 all the way through to 1989. With the Commodore 64 being a more internationally adopted system than the Beeb, this video also gives me the chance to look at some mags from countries outside the UK. I won't be going into quite the level of depth as I do in the BBC typing series, and will only focus on any magazine content that specifically relates to the C64. I also have far less knowledge about basic programming on this machine, so I'll probably only give the listings a quick once over, though I might try and pick out some differences between C64 and BBC Basic. With all that said, let's get started. I'm beginning with the debut issue of Commodore Horizons, the independent Commodore magazine it says on the front cover. This is dated December 1983 and January 1984 and has a cover price of just 75 pence. For a launch issue, the cover doesn't really stand out, predominantly having a pale blue background with darker blue text. There is a picture in the middle of it which isn't particularly exciting. It says "In Space" on the C64 and you can see a guy in a cockpit, a starfield in the background and a Commodore 64 kind of plonked on top of it. It also mentions a competition on the front cover where you can win a Commodore disk drive system, which in 1983 would have been a pretty appealing prospect. It's a pretty small magazine at just 52 pages, and on the contents page you can see that it contains the usual kind of thing you'd expect in these magazines: a letters page, news section, software reviews, an assessment of some printers, articles about business programming and robot power, and at least 2 game listings, which is what of course I'm going to be focusing on. I won't go through the editorial in too much detail, but it does say welcome to the first issue of this new magazine for all users of Commodore's micros. Whatever your machine, and whether you're a games addict or a serious user, you'll find something of interest inside. Later in this intro, the editor bemoans the fact there are very few firms producing Commodore software. It says this is most notable when compared to the hundreds of small innovative software companies producing original material for the Sinclair Spectrum computers. We think it's time that those software companies started producing software for the Commodore range of machines. Why not join us in a campaign to persuade some of the Spectrum software houses to start writing software for the Commodore VIC-20 and 64? Obviously this was quite early days for the Commodore 64, so it is interesting to see that the editor felt that it wasn't particularly well supported, given how popular it would become over the coming years. So just to pick out a couple of interesting bits and pieces from this magazine, page 6 features a full page advert from Llamasoft, awesome games software it says beneath their logo. It's got some really nice artwork that was presumably drawn by Jeff Minter and taken from the covers of various games, and the games featured on this advert include Laser Zone, Metagalactic Llama's Battle at the Edge of Time, Matrix, Hover Bother, Attack of the Mutant Camels, Abductor and Grid Runner. Just a few pages on from that in the news section there's a feature about Llamasoft too, with the headline "And now Revenge of the Mutant Camels." There's a picture of a very young looking Jeff Minter, I mean he was young at this point in time, and it says Jeff Minter of Llamasoft is working on a new game for the Commodore 64, Revenge of the Mutant Camels. It gives an overview of the game and then some comments from Minter himself saying the camels jump in a really ludicrous way and when they sit down they look very silly. It's great. The article's rounded off by saying the new 64 game should be finished by mid-December and priced at £7.50. Jeff will then start work on his next VIC-20 game, the follow-up to Metagalactic Llama's Battle at the Edge of Time. Jumping to the back cover of the magazine, here's an advert from PSS who say they're introducing the first of many for the Commodore 64. To launch their new range of software they've selected the finest arcade action and adventure from the USA, Canada and the UK. And this was particularly of interest to me because I'm trying to collect all of these games. I've got 4 or 5 of them already and I've reviewed 2 of them on my Witchfinders Game in Vault series, Moby Dick and Crystals of Zong. The other games featured here are Metro Blitz, Neoclips and Cosmic Split, along with Easy Tutor, which is some kind of educational software that I'm definitely not going to collect. In the top right hand corner of the advert it says these games are available at Boots now. Remember when Boots sold computer games? Those were the days. Jumping back inside the magazine to page 39 we see the start of the Commodore software file section, which features a number of program listings. This is on top of the 2 listings mentioned in the contents page, so if you're looking to type programs in, this magazine gives you a good selection. Flipping over to page 40 we can see the game that I'm going to be taking a look at from this magazine, Apple Fall. Described as a C64 game from Gary Turner and Andrew Wilson in Macclesfield. A monumental structure has been erected in Newton's honour, but it's doomed to be bombarded by apples falling from the sky. Consequently, in order to save the masterpiece from sure destruction, a robot has been assigned the job of catching the falling apples, thus preventing the structure from damage. However, the robot must be quick enough to negotiate ladders and vault over gaps in order to catch the falling apple before it hits a platform. To help him in his task, a transporter beam has been installed on both sides of the structure, making his job easier and movement across the screen quicker. Should the robot touch the sides of the screen or fall from the scaffolding, his existence will be terminated, and it's possible he may become trapped in gaps created by the falling apples. Also, once he's collected 10 apples or less, he must deposit them in collecting baskets while the apples are still falling, so be quick. There's then mention of the game being playable using a joystick, and it says a comprehensive set of instructions is contained within the program which incorporates sound and user-defined graphics, as well as the ability to change the difficulty of the game by altering the ZZ equals 1 to question mark variable in line 30. That actually makes it sound like you need to change the code to alter the difficulty, rather than being able to set it from within the finished game. Much like many of the BBC listings that I've looked at, you then get an overview of the program breaking down what's going on by line number, followed by a list of the variables at the top of the next page. The listing then begins and it covers just over 2 pages, with a line count of just under 200. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I'm not really that familiar with Commodore 64 BASIC, but one thing that stands out immediately that's different to the BBC is the use of peek and poke commands, which are all over the place in the first 400 or so lines. That's where the majority of the program logic lies, because after that comes a very large section that's just printing out the instructions on the screen. It accounts for over 40 lines of the program, so if you really wanted to type it in quicker, you could probably skip most of those. Also interesting to see is a number of data statements, much like the BBC has, which are defining the graphical characters used in the game, and below that is something even more interesting, which is essentially the level layout implemented as a bunch of print statements. The text size on the listing is decent and it's printed very clearly, so overall this looks like a pretty easy one to type in. So with that, let's now take a look at the first Commodore 64 typing game of this spin-off series. As I just noted from the listing, the game begins with several detailed pages of instructions, but there are quite a few typos in the version I downloaded, suggesting whoever typed it in didn't have the best attention to detail. Spoiler alert, that became more apparent when I got into the actual game. I did like the very last bit that says press a key to play this ace game, which might be over-egging it a little. Once you press a key to start, you're presented with a single screen platforms and ladders game, where you must navigate the environment to catch the falling apples, then take them to the baskets on either the left or right hand side of the screen to store them and bank extra points. The graphics are very simple single character affairs and the sound effects are just as basic, but the game does have some charm from a visual perspective. The idea of the game is quite neat, but movement to your character is too slow to allow you to get to many of the apples. The controls are also quite sluggish, so you need to move carefully to avoid dying, especially when jumping. You have to press fire and then move the direction you want to jump rather than the other way around, or you risk throwing yourself down the gap you're trying to get over. The version I played seemed to be significantly bugged, suggesting some mistakes were made when it was typed in. The screen layout is problematic. As you start the game in a hole, you can't get up the ladder at the right side, and it's impossible to get back to the left side from the right if you move past a certain point. The transporters are never enabled either, you just die whenever you go on them. One positive bug is that the limit of missing 5 apples before you die doesn't apply, which does make the game easier. Although it looks simple, the game does have a kind of addictive one more go factor once you get into it, but the bugs mean you won't last too long, and missing out on apples time and time again gets frustrating. Perhaps a bug-free version would have offered more enjoyment though. Let's move on to the next magazine then. I'm jumping forward to 1984, but only a month later than the last magazine I looked at. This is issue number 45 of Personal Computer News, dated the 21st of January. I've looked at this magazine several times in the BBC Micro Typing series, so you should be familiar with it if you've watched that. Immediately on the front cover I can see something I would be looking at if I was doing that BBC series, which is a free pull-out Electron guide. Of more interest for this video though is the picture in the centre of the page, which is Commodore's portable SX64, so we'll take a quick look at the article about that. Also mentioned in the bottom left hand corner is PCM Programs, free software for the Commodore 64. That's a reference to the typing game that I'm going to be looking at. Let's move inside the magazine now, and I'll jump straight to page 20 for the article entitled Takeaway Micros. This is a comparison of various portable computers available on the market, and of course the one I'm interested in is featured in the bottom left hand corner here, the Commodore SX64. The article says Commodore's portable version of the 64 has been awaited with interest by Commodore enthusiasts for some months. The SX64 owes much to the trend-setting Osborne Portable. More interestingly, it slots into the noticeable price gap in the current micro lineup, the market region between £500 and £1,000 for a working disk system. At £700, the SX should prove a popular choice for people who want a reasonably transportable computer to perform a specific set of tasks. Commodore obviously thinks that word processing would be a firm favourite, as the Easy Writer program is bundled in the price. The article then goes on to talk about other portable computers, including the Olivetti M10, the Tandy Model 100 and the NEC 8201A. It then goes back to give a more detailed review of the SX64, saying it's basically a conventional Commodore 64 and one of its standard 5¼ inch disk drives squeezed into a heavy duty carrying case with a 5-inch colour monitor and power supply. The article points out that the first thing you'll notice about the SX is the inadequacy of the screen. It says at the best of times colour monitors like these are only just adequate as screen displays, and when you shrink them down to 5 inches and squeeze 40 characters across a line, you're asking for trouble. It goes on to give further information about the screen and disk drive, and then says for the Commodore enthusiast, of course, none of this matters much. They know exactly what they're getting, except for the weight. With the reviewer going on to say, in the course of testing the SX, it made the commuter's journey home with me and back to the office. It's not so bad over a short distance, but walk with it any further than 200 yards and you'll be changing arms to stay the course. That criticism of the weight continues in the final comparison of these portable machines. The roundup notes the pros and cons of the different machines, noting that the smaller portables offer convenience at the expense of processing power, whereas the luggables, as they describe them here, such as the SX64, can be moved about but hardly provide any sort of portable solution. It rounds up by saying the Commodore SX makes a nice bundled package to buy but not to carry. Another section of this magazine that would have been of interest to Commodore 64 users is this roundup of recently released games. I'm not going to go into any of the detail here, but if you want to take a look for yourself, the games covered in this edition include Crossfire, Bonker, Everest Ascent, Road Toad, Cataclysm and Laser Strike. Not really any standout titles that I know of there, but this was pretty early days for the C64 still, at the beginning of 1984. Just a couple of pages on from those game reviews is the type-in listing from this magazine, Battlestar Fighter, and in the top right you can see a screenshot of the game, which is a cockpit view space shooter. The introduction says at last a game for the Commodore 64, and a zap zoom one at that. If as an expert computer user you've ever wanted to learn how to fly a starfighter, this simulator from Gary and Brian Rushby of Great Sutton in South Wirral is just what you've been looking for. The game uses joystick port 2 to control the fighter, but can easily be converted to run from the keyboard. It says to notice that you're controlling your fighter and not the alien, so if the alien is above you, pull the stick back, and if the alien is to your right, then push the stick to the right to line yourself up so you can blast the alien out of the sky. It rounds up by saying the program makes good use of the 64's sprite facilities to define the alien spacecraft that you're after. You have to hit the alien 5 times to kill it, and it needs to be in the centre of your sights to hit it at all. That's it for the overview of the game, and the listing begins below, spanning a total of 4 pages. The line numbering is pretty erratic here, so I can't give you a total line count, but I'd estimate it's about 300. In the left hand column of each page are the main program notes, which give a pretty detailed overview of the program structure, so if you're struggling to make a certain part of the game work, you could zone in on what each section's doing. The listing also features some REM statements that correlate with those program notes for the most part. There are quite a few similarities between this and the previous listing I looked at. Once again I can see plenty of peaks and pokes, and on the third page of the listing you can quite clearly see the layout of the cockpit being implemented as a series of print statements. Much like the previous listing, there's also some pretty comprehensive instructions here by the looks of it. Following those you can see the definition of all the graphical objects in the game, including the sights, enemy ship and explosions. There's also some quite fun hand-drawn artwork on each of the pages, with some sci-fi inspired objects that fit the theme of the game. That's enough looking at the listing though, let's move on and play the game. Presentation in this one is pretty decent, with good instructions and a high score table too. The game itself is very similar to one that I played in the Star Wars special of my BBC Microtyping series last May, which was simply called Star Wars. Graphically there have been some interesting decisions made that are sure to amuse those that deride the C64 for its drab colour scheme. I cannot comprehend why the writer of this game chose all the brown for the cockpit and then grey for outer space, when they could have used grey for the ship and black for the outside. Having said that, there is a very nice sprite for the TIE Fighter inspired enemies given the limitations of the basic language. The sounds are just simple spot effects, and it would have been better if there was a different noise for getting a hit on the enemy ships. Gameplay wise, there's not much here to keep you interested. You just have to hit as many enemies as possible whilst trying to get to grips with the inverted controls. There's not really a lot of scope for replayability due to the fuel limit. It would have been better if you advanced levels after a certain number of enemies destroyed and get a fuel top up and bonus score. Enemy ships don't fire back, so there's not much pressure, and it's hard to know if you've hit them or not other than keeping an eye on your score. With the controls being a little sluggish as well, this game really needed more work to give it any kind of longevity. Time to move on to the third magazine. As I mentioned in the introduction to this video, the Commodore 64's international appeal means I can look at magazines from other countries, and this is Home Computer Magazine, which originated in the United States. As you can see underneath the name of the magazine there, it says focusing exclusively on Apple, Commodore, IBM and Texas Instruments, which were probably the four most common brands of computer in the States at this point in time, which is 1985 by the way. There's no date on this, but it's volume 5 number 4, so I suspect maybe it was released in April. It is quite a dry looking magazine, there's not a lot of fun to be had from it based on the image on the front cover, but it does say here that it contains 37 typing programs, so there's definitely some content here if you want to try your hand at programming. A few pages in, it's got this introduction to the magazine for new readers, and I'm going to pick a couple of things out here of interest. The first thing is that it says there's no outside advertising, and sure enough, if you skim through the magazine, there are no adverts in it at all. It says, freed from the pressures of servicing advertisers, we concentrate on serving our readers. Each issue provides uninterrupted editorial flow and graphic layouts for better comprehension, plus unbiased product reviews that focus on true strengths and weaknesses. It also says, as we've seen on the front cover, that it's focused on the 4 hot home brands. We are 4 system-specific magazines under one wrapper, not a sprawling general interest publication which attempts to cover too wide a field only to spread itself too thin. At the bottom it says you'll learn more about your Apple, Commodore, IBM or Texas Instruments home computer from this one magazine than from a host of more limited sources. So very bold claims from this magazine, and it does seem to be doing something a little bit different to other magazines I've looked at in the past. Moving on to the contents page, which is nicely presented with a variety of imagery, let's have a quick look at what you can expect to find in this magazine. Starting with the features, we've got Run Day View, Trig Tricks, Archo Droid, which is the game I'm going to be taking a look at, Mine Over Matter, which I presume is another game, Macros, which says is Mac drawing 1 pixel at a time, IBM Impressions, looking through computer windows, Razzle Dazzle, which says record in 3-part harmony, Apple Seedlings, how about an apple pie chart? Wow, there's some terrible puns in this contents page. Commodore Hornblower, which says get in and change SIDS filters, which I'm going to take a closer look at in a minute. Information about speeding up a basic program, Algorithmetrics, building a logo adventure, and then product reviews including Injured Engine, Sidekick, Jane, Worlds in Creation, the Adventure Construction Set and Adventure Master, Romancing the PC Junior with the Quad Junior expansion chassis, expensive but tricky it sums it up as there, the Display Enhancement Package, Ski Writer 2, Alien Edition, an edgy game that shows its age, and A Day at the Races, Quick Load versus Mac 5, which utility breaks to tape, which it says is for the Commodore 64, so I'm going to guess that's a comparison of fast loaders. So as I said, there doesn't seem like a whole lot there that's going to be a lot of fun, but there is some games coverage to some extent, including a couple of typing lists. Just to take a very quick look at this Commodore Hornblower article, it says, have you changed your filters lately? Try changing the ones on this hot little sound engine, Commodore's amazing SID chip. The introduction says, besides frequency, waveform and envelope, the Commodore SID chip has some other tricks up its sleeve. Filters. And unlike the filters you may find in your car, these don't get dirty. The filters provided by the C64 are not surprisingly sound filters. You can filter any one of the SID's 3 voices, together or separately. Combined with the other features found on the SID chip, sound filters can be used to create some impressive effects. I'm not going to cover any more detail of the article, but if you're interested in the SID chip and what you can do with it, then this one might be worth a look. It does ultimately result in a typing listing later in the magazine that allows you to play around with the filters on the SID chip. I'll now move to the news section, mocked up like a newspaper called the Home Computer Industry Journal, and the article I'm looking at here has a headline, Commodore Sales Drop. Publishers ignore C64 for Apple, IBM and aftermarket. Is the C128 only a stopgap for the coming Amiga? It says software sales for the Commodore 64 are dwindling as the machine ages and as software makers continue to narrow their focus to programs for the Apple and IBM machines. To increase their sales volume and overall profits, Electronic Arts, CBS and other companies have cut 15 to 40% off prices on older Commodore and Atari programs, and have cut dealer costs on newer titles by about 16%. It later says that the Commodore 128 with C64 and CPM compatibility was to start shipping in May. However, some market analysts have said that it may be a short-lived machine, released as a stopgap product until Commodore can release its much talked about Amiga computer this summer. Another short-lived product, the Commodore Executive Portable Computer with 64K and 5-inch screen, is being advertised for under $400 by a national liquidator. That's the SX64 that I was looking at earlier. Now remember, this is 1985 and the US view of the market, but I think what they're talking about here predominantly is business software rather than games. As we know, games for the Commodore 64 continue to be produced for a good 6 to 7 years after the publication date of this magazine. Maybe that wasn't so much the case in the States as it was in Europe though. Time to take a look at the typing game from this magazine now, and this is Archo Droid, and the first thing to point out is that this is a cross-platform typing game. As you can see from the top right hand corner, there are icons representing the Apple, Commodore 64, PC, PC Junior and Texas Instruments computers, so if you had any of those you're able to type in this game and play it. There's a lot of information here and I'm going to skim past most of it, but a couple of things to pick out is firstly it says this game is based on an old favourite, Lost Ruins, originally published in HCM's forerunner 99er magazine. Enhanced by added sound and colourful graphics, even our long-time fans will greatly enjoy this much improved version. The introductory paragraph then says the year is 9999. Interstellar travel is now commonplace. Civilizations have risen and fallen through the millennia as human beings have ventured into the distant galaxies, but what of mankind's past? There's then a huge amount of backstory that I'm not going to go into, before it then gives details of how to play the game. Under the heading Starting to Dig, it says as the game begins, you've just touched down on the planet and dispatched your 3 Archo Droids to the surface. You may use either keyboard or joystick to guide one robot at a time. Each robot can carry up to 10 charges in the blaster at a time. After all 10 charges have been used, they can be replaced by returning the robot to the mothership. The blaster is your only tool for digging new tunnels. Each blaster charge clears 5 squares of earth in the direction that the robot was moving when you gave the order to set off a charge. As your Archo Droid digs deeper and deeper into the planet's surface, the danger from cave-ins becomes more serious. Each charge you detonate causes the layers of rock and garbage above you to shift. It's easy to become trapped, so watch your escape route as you tunnel. That's probably enough detail for now. You'll see how to play the game when I look at it, but basically the idea is you've got to tunnel through the earth and recover artifacts of archaeological significance, including skeletons, cars and junk piles. There's a couple of screenshots of the IBM version of the game, and I have to say they look pretty poor compared to the much less powerful at this point C64. There's also the keyboard controls for each version of the game on the right hand side here. To see the program listing you have to jump to page 70 of the magazine. It gives a very detailed guide for typing in the programs and then a contents page that tells you where to find each one. As you can see here, Archo Droid for the C64 begins on page 114, and jumping to that you're faced with this, which is an absolute horror show. Clearly the scan quality isn't the best, but you can see that the magazine has decided to lay out the listings in this horrendous way by putting each character of each line in a separate column, with each of the columns divided by a very thick black line. I'm not even going to try and analyse this one. All I'm going to say is about 270 lines, and good luck to you if you ever wanted to try typing this one in. Thankfully, somebody else already did the hard work for me, so let's take a look at it. The game begins with an introductory screen that displays a starfield while the game loads, in inverted commas. I'm not sure exactly what's going on during this initialisation process, which takes a little while to complete, but a few of the typing games I looked at seem to do it. Unlike the first 2 games I've looked at in this video, there's no in-game instructions for this one and it doesn't retain a high score either, so the presentation is a little lacking. Instead, you just get thrown straight into the action after the playfield is slowly drawn on the screen. The graphics are again pretty simple, as seems to be the case with most basic listings on the C64, with single characters making up the screen and no animation, but the ship looks good and the artifacts, made up of several connected characters, are quite well drawn. Sound-wise, it's a little improved over the first 2 games, with effects for blasting, collecting and moving, and also a simple tune when you lose a life. The game is actually quite an interesting idea, a mixture of puzzling and action. Some strategic thinking is required as you have to work out where to blast to avoid damaging artifacts, and also keep enough charges to allow you to make a clear path back to the ship. Unfortunately, movement is quite slow, so progress is laborious as there's lots of trekking back and forth to drop off items. This version I downloaded also seems to be bugged, as eventually your first robot will die and then others die very quickly afterwards. Then when you restart the game, all of them die almost immediately. I'm guessing some kind of counter in the game is not working as designed. There's also lots of beeping before they die and the controls stop responding, so there's definitely something going on in the code that causes those issues, unless it's an incompatibility with my later version of the C64. To be honest, it's not hugely surprising if a bug crept into the code based on how horrendous that listing looked. It's kind of a shame as the game does have some redeeming qualities and the concept is quite original. Swap those bugs, add in high score retention, and I could see this one having some replay value, for a short while at least. It's that time again where I say thank you to all my channel members, whose names you can see here in my Supporters Hall of Fame. If you're enjoying this video and would like to join these fine folks and support my efforts, why not become a member yourself? For a monthly fee starting from just 99p, you can get access to the special membership perks shown on screen, and more besides. If you're interested, then please click on the join button below this video for more information. If you're not able to commit to a monthly contribution but would still like to support my channel, then you could also give a super thanks. This one-off donation gives you a highlighted comment on whichever video you choose to click the button on, and anyone doing this will also get a shout out from me on a subsequent video. The super thanks button can be found below every video I produce. For the next magazine, I'm sticking in the United States and jumping forward 2 years to the April 1987 edition of Commodore Magazine. As you can see from the cover here, this is a special programming issue with over 20 free typing programs, handy for the subject matter of this video. One of those is Moonlight Zone, which is the one I'm going to be taking a look at. We've got some more space age artwork here with a Commodore disk drive flying away from the Earth, and the other features mentioned on the front cover are making the user port work for you and burst mode on the Commodore 128. Let's take a look at the contents page for this one, and some of the other features in this issue include one on telecommunications, Adventure Road, which I assume is an overview of some text adventures, game programs including SDI Star Wars, Moonlight Zone as I've mentioned, and Amiga Life, technical tips and sections that are dedicated to Commodore 64, 128 and Amiga users. I'm not going to be looking at any of those articles though, because I thought it'd be interesting to look at some of the game adverts in this magazine. As this is a US focused magazine rather than British, we can see some game adverts that we wouldn't have seen in the UK magazines, and straight away on the opposite page of the contents is one for the Bard's Tale 2 from Electronic Arts. Electronic Arts games for the Commodore 64 were massive in the States at this point in time, all provided on disc of course, and games like the Bard's Tale series were well renowned for taking full advantage of the disc system. Moving on to page 27, we can see a great advert for several arcade conversions being published by Data East. As the advert says, #1 arcade hits for your computer, and you can see the arcade machines at the top there, Karate Champ, Commando and Kung Fu Master, with the box art for the home conversions blasting out of them towards the bottom of the page. What's marginally interesting here is that while Karate Champ and Kung Fu Master were both developed by Data East for the arcades, Commando was developed by Capcom, and yet for some reason it got a home conversion by Data East. I guess that kinda makes sense because Capcom weren't bothered about doing conversions to home computers. Moving on a few pages from there, we can see this slightly provocative advert for Cinemaware's Defender of the Crown. To the victor go the spoils, it says at the top of the page, and below that is presumably what they're suggesting the spoils will be, this busty princess reaching out towards you from the page. There's a quote from Computer Entertainer magazine saying what an experience like being in a movie, and down the right hand side are several screenshots from the Atari ST, Apple II GS, Macintosh and amazingly the Commodore 64 with a colour scheme that looks too good to be true. And finally, on the following page is an advert from one of the most prestigious US publishers, Epix. Stay on top of world events, it says. And this is an advert for all of their multi-event sports games that were released at that point. World Games, Summer Games 2 and Winter Games. Of course, the majority of the games I've just looked at were released in the UK, but it's nice to see some different presentation of the adverts for them. Time to take a look at the games listing now then from this magazine, the Moonlight Zone, which begins with a very text-heavy page describing the backstory and how to play the game, illustrated by this man in a suit being chased by some weird snakes. The introduction says you're an average citizen living in an apartment located on the 50th floor of a new apartment building. It's a typical evening, everything appears quiet and you're just about ready to settle back to read a newspaper and watch television. Suddenly, the lights go off and the television set goes blank. You assume it's just a temporary power failure, but then the apartment high-rise begins to sway. Spinning creatures appear out of nowhere and start to laugh and proclaim that you'll never be able to leave the apartment building. Are you dreaming? Could these creatures just be part of your imagination? The answer is no. You've just crossed over into another dimension, a dimension which is ruled by creatures called moonbeams. You see, you've just crossed over into the Moonlight Zone. I think this is supposed to be a twist on the Twilight Zone. It goes on to say you're not a person who gives up easily, you're determined to make it to the first floor of the building and escape. You must pass through the openings on each floor and down to the next. The situation, however, is worse than you thought. The moonbeams are roaming the building, and if a moonbeam catches you, it carries you up 5 floors and you're blopped. In addition, the girders of the apartment complex have become electrified, so if you touch one, you're also blopped. You must not give up and you must get out of the building. There's then a wealth of further information about how to play the game, but I'm going to skip over that. We'll see the game soon enough. The listing then begins a couple of pages later and spans 3.5 pages overall. Once again, the line numbering is quite erratic, but I estimate this is probably a little under 200 lines. The layout of the listing is cramped, but relatively clearly printed and easy to read. Once again, I'm not going to be delving into the code, but again you can see plenty of peek and poke statements and a huge number of data statements towards the end of the listing as well. Let's take a look at it now and see if it's an improvement on any of the earlier basic listings I've looked at. There are no instructions or title screen for this one, it just starts the game as soon as it loads. Putting aside all that elaborate backstory, this is in essence a very simple maze game, but there is a challenge to avoid the randomly moving enemies and get to the bottom of the maze as quickly as possible. The graphics are a notable improvement on the 3 previous games I've looked at. The player sprite is fairly large and multicoloured, but it's a shame that the animation is limited to him only facing one direction. The maze walls use the simple single character graphics seen in the earlier games, but the enemies are large, move smoothly and have different speeds and behaviour depending on their colour. For example, the yellow one is very slow, whereas the blue one moves fast and seems to home in on you. There's also scrolling in the game, though it's not the smoothest. There are very limited sound effects and nothing at all when you're moving, but there's actually some half decent tunes played when the game begins and when you die. This is reasonably fun for a few games until you get to grips with it, but it's not very replayable. It's a shame it doesn't introduce new levels with different colour walls and maze design, and also faster or different looking enemies. As it stands, while it is an improvement on the earlier games I've looked at, it wouldn't really have got much attention given what else was available for the system in 1987. The final magazine I'm going to be looking at in this video is another international one, Happy Computer, which originates from Germany. As a result, I'm not going to be reading much out from this one. What I can discern from the front cover is this is a cross-platform magazine. You can see the Amstrad PC-2086 mentioned here, the Amiga, the Commodore 64, and there's also mention of Sega's new 16-bit video spiel, games console I assume that is, in their Power Play section. That of course would be the Mega Drive. This magazine, by the way, comes from March 1989, so we're getting towards the latter part of the C64's commercial life. Since I'm not going to be able to read much of this, I thought the best thing to do first was just take a look at the contents page. There's a few things I can pick out here. For example, there's MS-DOS, Atari and Commodore news, a hardware review section, a section entitled Story which seems to include a science fiction tale called Strangers in the Night, a software review section and also some program listings including ones for the Amiga, Atari ST, C64, Amstrad CPC and MS-DOS. While I'm not going to attempt to decipher it, one article that did catch my attention is this, entitled Himmelstürmer C64. Himmelstürmer, as far as Google says, translates to Skystormer, and based on the picture below, this seems to be suggesting that someone's using the Commodore 64 as some kind of flight training tool. As you can see, it's got this elaborate control panel attached to it, and the screen displaying lots of aircraft information. As I say, not even going to try to translate it, but it does look quite interesting. I'll move swiftly on to the game I'm going to be looking at from this magazine, and this is the Listing des Monats, or Listing of the Month. Even I could manage to translate that without using Google. And the game is called De Blobber und die Luftballons, or just Blobber for short. Written by Jan Schrader, who's pictured on the left hand page, what I can make out from this box out on the right is that it's compatible with the Commodore 64 and 128. It's written in assembler, and I think by the looks of it you have to save it to disk. What really stands out here is the screenshot of the game on the left hand page, which shows the game having a look very similar to a popular Taito arcade game from 1986. As for the actual listing, that starts at the bottom of the right hand page, and as I mentioned, it's written in assembler, and over the next 4 pages you can see an endless sequence of lines of hexadecimal code that need to be typed into an assembler. This one will definitely be a chore and probably quite hard to debug if you get it wrong, but as you've seen from the screenshot, the end result looks pretty impressive, so let's take a look at it. So here is Blobber, and well, this really is a step up from everything I've looked at so far. It begins with an excellent title screen that has a great SID tune and a high score table. The game is clearly inspired by the arcade classic Bubble Bobble, with its single screen platforming layout, cute characters and support for 2 simultaneous players, but the objective is slightly different to the Taito game. You need to destroy 12 enemies per level and collect the items they turn into when killed to complete the stage. If you don't pick up the objects before they disappear, new enemies will spawn in their place. Considering this is a type-in listing, the graphics are absolutely lovely, with nicely designed sprites, loads of bright colours and great animation. There are plenty of different enemies and items, including several power-ups. Everything moves really smoothly, and you'll see up to 6 sprites on screen with no noticeable slowdown. The sound effects by contrast are quite simplistic, and it's a shame there's no in-game tune given the one on the title screen is good. The game is quite difficult as dropped items disappear quickly and the enemies respawn, so it can be tough to get the 12 items required to complete a stage. The level layouts can sometimes be annoying too, making it hard to get to the top without hitting an enemy on a platform above you on some of them. It may not quite match Bubble Bobble in the gameplay stakes, but looks wise it's pretty damn close, and this is quite an amazing typing game, even given the amount of effort it would require to enter accurately. Blobber is essentially commercial quality and could have been a really popular budget release. It's certainly better than many games that were released by Mastertronic or Codemasters the same year. That does it for this brief history of Commodore 64 typing games. From a very quick journey through 6 years of listings, you can see huge development in the quality of games offered by magazines, with very simplistic basic listings eventually giving way to near commercial quality assembler based code. That would have been a real chore to type in, but definitely resulted in a very good game. It's been interesting to compare these games to those I've looked at in my main BBC Micro typing series, and I think it's fair to say that BBC Micro Basic definitely seems to be more powerful and flexible than its C64 equivalent. Of the games I looked at, there's no doubt that Blobber is a standout, but I also like the concept of Archo Droid, even if suspected bugs in the game made it semi-unplayable. I've seen enough in this video to make me think about doing another episode of this spin-off series in the future, so if that's something you'd like to see then let me know. On that note, if you enjoyed this video then please give it a like and let me know any thoughts you have about the games or magazines I've looked at in the video comments. The pinned comment on this video features links to the mags if you want to explore them further. Unfortunately, I can't provide links to the games as they were all sourced from ROM sites, but you can refer to GameBase64 to find details of these and other typing games for the system, and Google will help you find the ROMs if you do want to try them out. For fans of my BBC Micro typing series, fear not, I will be working on that again soon. I'd intended this video to be out in January, which gives you an idea of how much I'm struggling to find time to do this type of content at the moment. I'm therefore thinking of adopting the format of this one for the BBC videos in future, with a little less focus on the magazines. I'm not sure exactly when the next video in that series will be ready, but it'll begin my look at typing listings from 1986 for the Acorn machine. Until that video is ready, you can be sure of more retro gaming content on this channel, so please stay tuned. Thanks very much for watching this video, and until the next time, see ya!